They said I came back from deployment a failure, that I'd washed out of the military without accomplishing anything meaningful, that I was living proof that not everyone is cut out for service. But nothing prepared me for the moment I walked into my sister's naval base charity gala wearing a borrowed dress, and the 3-star Admiral she'd been trying to impress all evening snapped to attention and said, "Commander Thompson, ma'am. I wasn't expecting to see you here." And just like that, my family's whispered conversations about my military failures stopped mid-sentence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. They said I came back from deployment a failure, that I'd washed out of the military without accomplishing anything meaningful, that I was living proof that not everyone is cut out for service. But nothing prepared me for the moment I walked into my sister's naval base charity gala wearing a borrowed dress, and the 3-star Admiral she'd been trying to impress all evening snapped to attention and said, "Commander Thompson, ma'am. I wasn't expecting to see you here." And just like that, my family's whispered conversations about my military failures stopped mid-sentence. I know some people think family disappointment has to be explosive. Dramatic confrontations, slam doors, ultimatums delivered over heated arguments. But sometimes it's just a quiet rewriting of your story by people who never bothered to read the original. Sometimes it's sitting at your parents' kitchen table listening to your own sister explain to her Navy boyfriend why you're the family's cautionary tale about military service gone wrong. "Poor Rachel," my sister Kate had said 6 months earlier, stirring her coffee while her boyfriend, Lieutenant Commander James Morrison, nodded sympathetically from across the table. She enlisted right out of high school with all these big dreams about serving her country and making a difference. But military life just broke her. The words hit like friendly fire, unexpected and devastating, precisely because they came from someone who was supposed to be on my side. I sat there in my parents' living room, wearing civilian clothes that felt like a costume, listening to Kate construct a narrative about my service that bore no resemblance to reality. "She came back from her first deployment completely different," Kate continued, her voice taking on that careful tone people use when discussing family tragedies. "Couldn't adjust to civilian life, couldn't hold down a regular job, couldn't even talk about what happened over there without getting all emotional and defensive." Emotional and defensive. As if my reluctance to discuss classified operations with my family over Sunday dinner was a character flaw rather than a legal obligation. James had nodded knowingly, the way people do when they think they understand something they've never experienced. It's tough when military service doesn't work out the way people hope. Not everyone's built for that kind of pressure. Not everyone's built for that kind of pressure. Coming from a lieutenant commander who'd spent his entire career in logistics and supply chain management, stationed exclusively at domestic bases, it felt like being lectured about combat by someone who'd never left the office. But what hurt most wasn't James's casual dismissal. It was Kate's eager agreement. The same sister who used to brag about having a badass military sister, when I was deployed, had somehow transformed my service into evidence of personal failure. "The worst part," Kate had said, lowering her voice like she was sharing classified information, "is that she won't admit it was a mistake. She keeps pretending that her military experience was valuable, that she learned important skills. But look at her now. 26 years old, no career prospects, living with our parents because she can't afford her own place. Living with our parents." That part was technically true, though not for the reasons Kate assumed. I'd been staying in my childhood bedroom for 3 weeks while transitioning between assignments, a temporary arrangement that had somehow become proof of my life falling apart. "Maybe," James had suggested gently, "she just needs to accept that military service wasn't the right path for her and focus on building civilian skills. There's no shame in recognizing when something doesn't work out. No shame in recognizing when something doesn't work out." As if 8 years of naval service, including 3 deployments and commendations for leadership under combat conditions, were something that didn't work out, rather than a career I'd built with precision and dedication. I didn't correct them. I didn't defend myself. I just nodded and excused myself from the conversation, walking to my temporary bedroom where my dress blues hung in the closet like ghosts of who they thought I used to be. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that while they saw a failed veteran living in her childhood bedroom, I was actually between commands, preparing for a promotion that would change everything they thought they understood about military success. Let me show you what happened next. I hadn't stepped foot on Naval Base San Diego in 8 months, not since my last assignment had officially ended, and I'd entered what my family assumed was permanent civilian life. But here I was, walking through the main gate in a borrowed evening gown, staring up at the flags, snapping in the Pacific breeze like I was entering a world I'd left behind forever. The Officers Club had been transformed for the annual Navy Relief Society charity gala, its usually Spartan interior draped in elegant fabric and twinkling lights. The air buzzed with conversation between uniformed officers and their civilian guests, the familiar sound of military protocol mixed with social pleasantries. My heels clicked against the polished floors where I'd once walked in combat boots, where I'd attended briefings and ceremonies that my family knew nothing about. This time I wasn't here as Lieutenant Commander Thompson. I was here as Kate's sister, the family disappointment she'd reluctantly invited because our mother had insisted that, quote, families should support each other's important events. Kate had been planning this evening for months, ever since she'd started dating James Morrison. This wasn't just a charity gala for her. It was her debut into military social circles, her chance to prove she belonged in the Navy community despite never having served herself. She'd spent weeks researching proper military etiquette, practicing how to address different ranks, and choosing an outfit that would make the right impression. Remember, she'd told me in the car, her voice tight with nervous energy. Tonight is really important for James's career. Admiral Westbrook will be there, and James is hoping to make a good impression for his next assignment. So please just try to blend in. Don't mention your military stuff unless someone specifically asks. And if they do, keep it brief and positive. Don't mention your military stuff. As if 8 years of naval service was an embarrassing hobby, rather than a career that had shaped every aspect of who I'd become. The ballroom was filled with the kind of people Kate desperately wanted to impress: senior officers and their spouses, defense contractors, local politicians who supported military causes. Everyone looked polished, successful, comfortable in their roles within the military hierarchy. Everything Kate thought I'd failed to become. I watched her work the room with James at her side, introducing herself to officers' wives and asking careful questions about base life and military traditions. She was trying so hard to fit into a world she'd never inhabited, using terminology she'd learned from Google searches and military girlfriend blogs. "Rachel, you clean up nice," James said when he spotted me near the bar, his tone carrying the slight condescension of someone who'd grown accustomed to viewing me as Kate's problematic sister. "I almost didn't recognize you without the—" He gestured vaguely, probably meaning the casual civilian clothes he'd always seen me wearing around my parents' house. "Thanks," I said simply, accepting a glass of wine from the bartender. "Kate mentioned you might feel a little out of place here," James continued, his voice taking on that careful tone people use when trying to be helpful. "But don't worry. Most of the civilians here don't have military backgrounds either. You'll fit right in. You'll fit right in." The irony was so sharp it was almost funny. James was trying to make me feel better about being a civilian at a military event, completely unaware that I'd attended dozens of similar functions in uniform, that I knew half the protocol officers personally, that I'd given speeches at ceremonies he'd only dreamed of attending. Around us, the evening's festivities continued. Kate had found Admiral Westbrook and was engaging him in what she clearly hoped was impressive conversation about naval history and maritime strategy. From across the room, I could see her animated gestures and bright smile as she tried to demonstrate her knowledge of military affairs. But what struck me most wasn't Kate's performance or James's patronizing kindness. It was how completely they'd erased my actual military experience from their understanding of who I was. In their minds, I was a civilian who'd briefly tried and failed at military service, not someone who belonged in this room more than either of them ever would. That's when I saw him, Admiral Westbrook himself, the 3-star flag officer Kate had been researching for weeks, standing near the podium and scanning the crowd with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to assessing personnel and situations. Admiral Westbrook moved through the crowd with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being the highest-ranking person in any room. At 62, he commanded respect without demanding it, his dress blue uniform displaying ribbons that told the story of a distinguished 30-year career. Kate had been watching him all evening, waiting for the perfect moment to approach with James. That moment came when the Admiral paused near the silent auction display, studying a framed photograph of the USS Gerald R. Ford. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Kate appeared at his side like she'd been planning this maneuver for hours, which she probably had. "Admiral Westbrook," she said, her voice pitched with the kind of carefully practiced confidence that came from weeks of rehearsal. "I'm Kate Thompson, Lieutenant Commander Morrison's girlfriend. Thank you so much for everything you do for our sailors and their families." The Admiral turned toward her with the polite attention senior officers give to civilians at military social functions. "Ms. Thompson, pleasure to meet you. Are you enjoying the evening?" "Oh, absolutely," Kate gushed, launching into what was clearly a prepared speech about her appreciation for naval service and her commitment to supporting military families. James stood beside her, beaming with pride as his girlfriend impressed one of the Navy's most senior leaders. I watched from across the room, sipping my wine and marveling at Kate's performance. She'd transformed herself into the perfect military girlfriend. Knowledgeable but deferential, supportive but not presumptuous, eager to learn about naval traditions and culture. "Actually," Kate said, her voice taking on that careful tone people use when they're about to share something they think makes them interesting, "military service runs in our family. My sister served for several years." She gestured toward me, and I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that came whenever my family discussed my military experience in public. "Really?" Admiral Westbrook asked politely, following Kate's gesture to where I stood. "Yes, she enlisted right out of high school," Kate continued, her voice carrying that mixture of pride and pity that had become so familiar. "She had such high hopes about making a career in the Navy, but unfortunately it didn't work out for her. The military can be very demanding, and not everyone is cut out for that kind of pressure." James nodded supportively. "Rachel's been struggling with the transition back to civilian life. It's been challenging for the whole family, watching someone you love try to find their place after military service doesn't pan out the way they hoped." I set down my wine glass with more force than necessary, the sound sharp enough to draw attention from nearby conversations. The Admiral's eyes shifted to me, and for a moment I saw something flicker across his expression. Confusion, perhaps, or recognition of something that didn't align with the story he was hearing. "It must be difficult," Admiral Westbrook said carefully, his eyes still fixed on me, "when military service doesn't meet expectations." "Oh, it's been heartbreaking," Kate said, warming to her subject. She came back from deployment completely different. Couldn't find steady work, couldn't adjust to normal life. We've all been trying to help her understand that there's no shame in admitting when something isn't the right fit. The Admiral's attention remained focused on me, and I could see him processing something that wasn't adding up. His expression had shifted from polite social interest to the kind of analytical attention senior officers develop when they sense important information isn't being shared. "And what was your sister's rate?" he asked Kate, using the Navy term for job classification. Kate looked confused. "Her rate?" "Her specialty," James clarified quickly, clearly trying to help his girlfriend navigate military terminology. "Rachel, what was your MOS?" He used the Army term instead of the Navy equivalent, revealing his own limited understanding of naval service. I could see the Admiral's eyebrows raise slightly at James's terminology error, but he said nothing. Instead, he continued to study me with growing interest, like he was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't have all its pieces. "I think she worked in logistics or something like that," Kate said uncertainly. She never talked about it much. "You know how it is with people who've had negative military experiences. They don't really want to relive it." The Admiral's expression had become completely unreadable, but his attention was now entirely focused on me, and something in his posture suggested that Kate's explanation wasn't satisfying whatever questions were forming in his mind. Admiral Westbrook's continued attention made Kate increasingly uncomfortable. She shifted her weight and glanced at James, clearly hoping he would redirect the conversation back to safer territory, where she could showcase her carefully researched knowledge of naval traditions. "Admiral," James interjected smoothly, "Kate's been incredibly supportive of my career. She's been learning so much about Navy culture and protocol. I think she'd make an excellent addition to any wardroom community. It was a transparent attempt to steer the conversation away from me and back to Kate's qualifications as a military girlfriend. But Admiral Westbrook seemed reluctant to let the subject drop. "I'm sure she would," he said politely, then turned back to Kate. "But I'm curious about your sister's service. 8 years is quite a commitment for someone who found military life unsuitable." Kate's smile faltered slightly. 8 years? "Oh no, Admiral. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Rachel only served for about 3 years before before it became clear that it wasn't working out for her." The Admiral's eyebrows rose slightly. 3 years? "Yes," Kate continued, gaining confidence as she corrected what she assumed was his miscalculation. "She enlisted right after high school, did basic training, then 1 deployment. But the military was just too much for her. Some people aren't built for that kind of structure and pressure." James nodded supportively. "It takes a special kind of person to succeed in military service. Not everyone has what it takes to handle the responsibility, the hierarchy, the demanding operational requirements." "The demanding operational requirements," Admiral Westbrook repeated slowly, his tone unreadable. "Exactly," Kate said, relieved that he seemed to understand. "Rachel always struggled with authority, with following orders, with the whole military mindset. She's more of a free spirit, you know? Creative, independent. The rigid structure of military life just crushed that spark in her. I felt the familiar burn of humiliation, as my sister described me like a failed science experiment, explaining to one of the Navy's most senior officers why I'd been unsuitable for military service. Every word felt like a small betrayal, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned her own narrative." "And what exactly was her position during this 3-year period?" Admiral Westbrook asked, his voice carrying the precision of someone accustomed to getting accurate information. Kate looked uncertain. "Some kind of support role, I think. Nothing too important or high level. She never had any real responsibility or leadership positions. That was part of the problem. She couldn't handle being promoted or taking on more complex duties." "No leadership positions," the Admiral repeated, his eyes fixed on me with increasing intensity. "Right," James added helpfully. "Military leadership requires a very specific skill set: strategic thinking, personnel management, decision-making under pressure. It's not something everyone can develop, especially if they're not naturally suited to command environments." The irony was so sharp, it was almost physically painful. James was explaining military leadership requirements to Admiral Westbrook, while simultaneously dismissing my capability for exactly those responsibilities. "She tried," Kate said, her voice taking on that sympathetic tone that made me want to disappear. "But some people just aren't cut out for military service, and there's nothing wrong with that. Not everyone can be a leader or handle high-pressure situations." Admiral Westbrook's expression had become completely neutral, the kind of professional mask senior officers develop when they're processing information that doesn't align with their understanding of reality. "High-pressure situations," he said quietly. "Yes," Kate nodded earnestly. "Rachel always got overwhelmed when things got complicated or stressful. That's why she could never advance beyond basic positions. The military needs people who can stay calm under pressure and make critical decisions quickly." The silence that followed was loaded with tension I didn't fully understand. Admiral Westbrook continued to study me with the focused attention of someone trying to reconcile conflicting pieces of intelligence. Finally, he spoke. "Miss Thompson, would you mind if I spoke with your sister directly? I'd like to hear about her military experience from her own perspective." Kate's smile became strained. "Oh, Admiral, I'm not sure that's a good idea. Rachel gets very uncomfortable talking about her military service. It brings up a lot of difficult memories about not succeeding." But Admiral Westbrook was already walking toward me, his expression suggesting that he'd heard enough secondhand accounts and was ready for primary source information. I didn't retreat when Admiral Westbrook approached me. Years of military training had taught me to stand my ground when senior officers wanted to speak, even when every instinct screamed to avoid the conversation that was about to shatter my family's carefully constructed narrative. "Ms. Thompson," Admiral Westbrook said as he reached me, his voice carrying the quiet authority that made 3-star admirals impossible to ignore. "I'd like to hear about your naval service if you don't mind." Behind him, I could see Kate and James watching nervously, probably worried that I was about to embarrass them by discussing my failed military career with one of the Navy's most senior leaders. "What would you like to know, sir?" I asked, automatically falling into the respectful tone that 8 years of service had made second nature. His eyebrows raised slightly at my use of proper military courtesy, something Kate had probably failed to mention during her explanation of my struggles with authority. "Your sister mentioned you served for 3 years," he said carefully, "in a support role, no leadership positions." I felt my jaw tighten. "Sir, I believe there may have been some miscommunication about the details of my service record." "I'm beginning to suspect there has been," Admiral Westbrook said, his tone suggesting he'd already identified several inconsistencies in Kate's account. "Why don't you tell me about your actual military experience?" The moment of truth had arrived. I could continue letting my family's narrative stand unchallenged, or I could tell Admiral Westbrook the truth that I'd been hiding for 8 months. But looking into his eyes that had evaluated thousands of naval officers during his career, I realized he already suspected that Kate's story didn't add up. "Sir, I served 8 years active duty," I said quietly. 3 deployments to the Persian Gulf and Mediterranean. Most recently as executive officer aboard USS Hampton, a Los Angeles-class attack submarine. Admiral Westbrook's expression didn't change, but I saw something shift behind his eyes. "Executive officer," he repeated. "Yes, sir. I was selected for command track and completed nuclear power school, submarine officer basic course, and department head training." The silence stretched between us as Admiral Westbrook processed this information. In the background, I could hear Kate's nervous laughter as she continued her conversation with other officers' wives, completely unaware that her narrative about my military failures was crumbling 10 feet away. "And your current status?" Admiral Westbrook asked. This was the question I'd been dreading. The truth that would change everything. "Sir, I'm currently between commands. I've been selected for promotion to commander and assignment as commanding officer of USS Connecticut, a Virginia-class attack submarine." Admiral Westbrook's poker face cracked slightly. Connecticut was one of the Navy's newest and most advanced submarines, and command of a nuclear submarine was reserved for the Navy's most elite officers. "When does that assignment begin?" he asked. 3 weeks, sir. I've been using the transition period to spend time with family before taking command." "Spending time with family," he repeated, and I could see him connecting the dots. The failed veteran living with her parents was actually a submarine commander using her leave time before assuming one of the most prestigious commands in the Navy. "Sir," I said quietly, "my family doesn't know about the promotion or the new command. They believe I left the Navy 3 years ago as an unsuccessful junior officer." Admiral Westbrook studied my face with the intensity of someone trying to understand a puzzle that had just revealed several missing pieces. "They believe you've been out of the Navy for 3 years." "Yes, sir." It seemed easier than explaining why I couldn't discuss my actual assignments or why I was frequently away for classified operations. "Classified operations," he nodded slowly, beginning to understand the scope of what I'd been hiding. "And they have no idea that you're about to take command of one of our most advanced submarines." "No, sir. As far as they know, I'm a failed veteran who couldn't handle military service." Admiral Westbrook was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from me to Kate, who was still enthusiastically discussing naval traditions with a group of officers' spouses, completely oblivious to the conversation happening behind her. "Commander Thompson," he said finally, using my rank for the first time, "I think it's time your family learned the truth about your naval career." My chest tightened as Admiral Westbrook's words sank in. For 8 months, I'd been living a careful lie, allowing my family to believe I was a civilian struggling with failed military service, while I actually served at the highest levels of naval operations. The deception had seemed necessary to protect both classified information and family relationships, but now it felt like a house of cards about to collapse. "Sir," I said quietly, "with respect, my family's understanding of my service has been simplified for operational security reasons." Admiral Westbrook's expression shifted to something that looked almost like amusement. "Operational security, of course." He paused, studying my face with the analytical attention of someone accustomed to evaluating personnel under complex circumstances. "Commander Thompson, May I ask why you chose to let your family believe you failed in military service rather than simply telling them your assignments were classified? The question hit at the heart of a decision I'd been questioning for months. Sir, it started during my first submarine deployment. My family couldn't understand why I couldn't call home regularly or explain where I was stationed. When I came back, they assumed my silence meant something had gone wrong. And you didn't correct that assumption. No, sir. It was easier to let them think I'd struggled than to explain that I couldn't discuss nuclear submarine operations. Over time, their narrative became more elaborate, and the truth became harder to reveal. Admiral Westbrook nodded slowly, and I could see him processing the psychological complexity of my situation. So while they believed you were washing out of the Navy, you were actually being selected for advanced nuclear training and command track. Yes, sir. Just then, a familiar voice called out from across the room. Admiral Westbrook? Kate was approaching with James at her side, her expression bright, with the kind of determined enthusiasm that meant she'd worked up the courage to make another social connection. Admiral, Kate said as she reached us, I hope Rachel hasn't been bothering you with her military stories. She sometimes gets a little intense about her service time. Admiral Westbrook's expression became carefully neutral. Actually, Miss Thompson, your sister has been quite illuminating about her naval experience. Kate's smile faltered slightly. Oh, well, I hope she's been realistic about it. Rachel sometimes exaggerates her role or importance. It's part of how she's been coping with not succeeding in military service. Exaggerates, Admiral Westbrook repeated, his tone carefully controlled. Yes, James added helpfully. It's actually quite common among veterans who struggled during their service. They sometimes inflate their responsibilities or achievements as a way of dealing with disappointment. I felt my face burn with humiliation as my sister and her boyfriend explained my psychological deficiencies to a 3-star admiral, using terminology they'd probably learned from online articles about veteran adjustment issues. I see, Admiral Westbrook said quietly. And what exactly do you believe Rachel is exaggerating about her service? Kate glanced at me nervously, probably worried that I'd said something embarrassing. Well, sometimes she talks about submarines or nuclear operations, but obviously that's just fantasy. Rachel never had the qualifications for anything that's specialized or important. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Admiral Westbrook's expression had become completely unreadable, but his attention was fixed on Kate with the intensity of someone trying to understand how such a fundamental misunderstanding could have developed. Never had the qualifications, he repeated slowly. Right, Kate said, gaining confidence. Nuclear submarine operations require years of specialized training and the highest security clearances. Only the Navy's most elite officers get selected for that kind of duty. Rachel was discharged as a junior enlisted person after just a few years. Admiral Westbrook looked at me, and I could see something shift in his expression. Not anger, but a kind of professional recognition that this conversation had reached a critical moment. Ms. Thompson, he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of naval authority, I think there's something you need to understand about your sister's actual naval career. That night, I sat in my childhood bedroom staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with the implications of what had almost happened at the gala. Admiral Westbrook had been seconds away from revealing my actual rank and position to Kate and James, a revelation that would have shattered 8 months of carefully maintained deception. But his discretion had given me something more valuable than continued secrecy. It had given me perspective on just how deep my family's misunderstanding had become. This wasn't just casual ignorance about my military service. This was a systematic reconstruction of my identity that served their own psychological needs. I opened my laptop and began doing what submariners do best: methodical intelligence gathering. First, I searched through my family's social media accounts, going back 3 years to when my narrative had supposedly begun. What I found made my stomach drop. Kate had been actively constructing and sharing the story of my military failure, not just with James, but with friends, coworkers, and extended family. A Facebook post from 2 years ago, worried about my sister Rachel. Military service was really hard on her and she's been struggling to find her place in civilian life. Please keep her in your thoughts. An Instagram story from 18 months ago, Family dinner with my sister who's going through a tough time after her military experience didn't work out. So proud of everyone who serves, but it's not right for everyone. A LinkedIn article she'd shared 6 months ago about veteran employment challenges, with her comment, "This hits close to home." My sister is experiencing many of these same struggles after her military service ended unsuccessfully. Each post garnered dozens of sympathetic comments and shares, turning my supposed failure into social media content that generated attention and sympathy for Kate. She'd built an entire online narrative around being the supportive sister of a struggling veteran. But it got worse. I found a group chat between Kate and her closest friends from 8 months ago, right around the time she'd started dating James. "James is so impressed that I have a military sister," Kate had written. "He keeps asking about her service, but honestly it's embarrassing. She barely made it through and came back kind of broken. I don't want him to think our family has issues." Her friend Ashley had responded, "Just be vague about it. Say she served honorably but had a hard time adjusting. That way you get credit for having a military family without the awkwardness." "Good idea," Kate had replied. "I'll just focus on how supportive I've been during her difficult transition." The manipulation was surgical in its precision. Kate had taken my actual absence, caused by classified submarine deployments, and reframed it as evidence of failure and struggle. When I couldn't discuss my work, she interpreted it as shame. When I lived quietly and modestly during transition periods, she saw it as inability to succeed in civilian life. Then I found the smoking gun, a text thread between Kate and James from 3 months ago. "Kate, I'm worried Rachel might say something weird about her military service when she meets your Navy friends. She sometimes exaggerates or makes up stories about submarines and classified stuff. James, that's pretty common with veterans who had negative experiences. They create fantasy versions of their service to cope with disappointment. I can help redirect conversations if needed." Kate: "Perfect. I just don't want anyone to think she's lying or delusional. It would reflect badly on our whole family." James: "Don't worry. I'll make sure people understand she's dealing with some post-service adjustment issues." They'd turned my operational security into evidence of psychological problems. My inability to discuss classified submarine operations had become proof that I was either lying about my service or mentally unstable from military trauma. The worst part was realizing that this narrative hadn't developed accidentally. Kate had actively shaped it, refined it, and used it to build sympathy and social connections. My supposed failure had become her success story. She was the devoted sister helping a struggling veteran, the understanding family member dealing with military-related challenges. I closed my laptop and looked at my dress uniform hanging in the closet, the insignia and ribbons representing 8 years of service that my family had reduced to a cautionary tale about military life gone wrong. Tomorrow's revelation was going to be about more than just rank and position. It was going to expose how completely my family had rewritten my story to serve their own needs. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 8 months. I put on my dress blue uniform. Every ribbon, every insignia, every piece of gold braid told the story of a naval career that my family had never bothered to understand. Looking in the mirror, I saw Lieutenant Commander Rachel Thompson, soon to be Commander Thompson, for the first time since coming home. I had a plan, and it was time to execute it with the precision that submarine warfare demanded. First, I called Admiral Westbrook's office. His aide put me through immediately, confirming that our conversation from the previous evening had left an impression. "Commander Thompson," Admiral Westbrook's voice carried a note of satisfaction. "I was hoping you'd call. I have a proposition that might interest you." "Sir, before we discuss anything else, I need to understand something. How much detail can I share with my family about my actual service record?" "Everything that's not classified," he said without hesitation. "Your rank, your assignments, your pending command, all of that is public information. The only restriction is operational details from your submarine deployments. And my promotion to commander will be announced in next week's Navy Times, along with your assignment to USS Connecticut. After last night's conversation, I'm actually looking forward to reading your family's reaction to that news." I felt a grim satisfaction at his words. "Sir, there's something else you should know. My family hasn't just misunderstood my service. They've actively constructed a narrative about my failure that they've been sharing publicly for years. How publicly? Social media posts, conversations with friends and colleagues, discussions with other military personnel. Kate has built a significant part of her identity around being the supportive sister of a struggling veteran. Admiral Westbrook was quiet for a moment. That's unfortunate and potentially embarrassing for her when the truth comes out. Yes, sir. Which brings me to my request. I'd like to arrange a formal meeting where I can reveal my actual service record in a way that makes denial impossible. What did you have in mind? A change of command ceremony. USS Connecticut's previous commander is retiring next week, and traditionally, families are invited to observe the formal transfer of authority. I'd like my family to witness me assuming command of a nuclear submarine. The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. Then Admiral Westbrook chuckled, a sound I'd never heard from a three-star admiral. Commander Thompson, that is perhaps the most spectacular way to correct a family misunderstanding that I've encountered in 30 years of naval service. Thank you, sir. I believe it will provide the clarity they need. 2 hours later, I was sitting in my parents' living room, still wearing my dress uniform, with formal invitation letters spread across the coffee table. My parents stared at the Navy letterhead in confusion while Kate and James sat in stunned silence. I don't understand, Kate said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. These letters are addressed to the family of Commander Rachel Thompson. But you're not. You're not a commander. Actually, I said calmly, I will be as of next Tuesday. The promotion ceremony is Thursday morning, followed immediately by the change of command ceremony where I'll assume authority over USS Connecticut. James picked up one of the letters with shaking hands. USS Connecticut. That's a Virginia-class attack submarine. Those are commanded by some of the Navy's most elite officers. Yes, I said simply, they are. My mother found her voice first. Rachel, I don't understand any of this. You left the Navy 3 years ago. You've been living here because you couldn't find work. Mom, I never left the Navy. I've been between commands, using leave time to spend with family before assuming one of the most prestigious positions in the submarine force. Kate's face had gone completely white. But you said, we thought, you let us believe you'd failed. I never said I'd failed. You assumed I'd failed because I couldn't discuss classified submarine operations, and I didn't correct that assumption. The silence that followed was absolute. Through the window, I could see neighbors going about their normal Saturday morning routines, completely unaware that inside our living room, 8 years of family mythology was crumbling in real time. Finally, my father spoke, his voice hoarse with disbelief. You're gonna command a nuclear submarine? Yes, sir. In 5 days. The change of command ceremony for USS Connecticut took place on a crystal-clear Tuesday morning at Naval Base New London. The submarine's imposing black hull stretched nearly 400 feet along the pier, its sail rising like a monolithic tower against the Connecticut sky. This wasn't just any submarine. This was one of the Navy's most advanced attack submarines, and I was about to assume command of its 134-person crew. My family sat in the front row of folding chairs arranged on the pier, their faces still displaying the shock that had defined the past 5 days. Kate wore a conservative dress and sunglasses that couldn't quite hide her red-rimmed eyes. James sat rigidly beside her, his expression cycling between disbelief and what looked like professional horror as he realized the magnitude of his misconceptions about my military career. The ceremony began with the traditional honors. The ship's crew arranged in perfect formation, the Navy band playing the national anthem, the flags snapping in the harbor breeze. Admiral Westbrook served as the presiding officer, his presence lending additional gravity to an already significant event. Ladies and gentlemen, Admiral Westbrook began, his voice carrying across the pier through the PA system. We are gathered today to witness the transfer of command of USS Connecticut from Commander Michael Harrison to Commander Rachel Thompson. At the sound of my rank and name echoing across the naval base, I saw Kate flinch as if the words were physically painful. For 5 days, she'd been trying to process the complete collapse of her understanding of my life, and the formal ceremony was making denial impossible. Admiral Westbrook continued with the traditional remarks about submarine service, but his words carried additional weight as he described the qualifications required for nuclear submarine command. The officers who command our attack submarines represent the Navy's most rigorously trained and carefully selected leaders. They undergo years of specialized education, including nuclear engineering training, submarine warfare certification, and comprehensive command preparation. I watched my parents exchange glances as Admiral Westbrook detailed the selection process that had led to my assignment. Everything Kate had dismissed as impossible, the specialized training, the security clearances, the years of preparation, was being explained as standard requirements for my position. When Admiral Westbrook called me forward to read my orders, my family heard the official language that had governed my career for 8 years. Commander Rachel Thompson is hereby directed to report to USS Connecticut as commanding officer, with all duties, responsibilities, and authorities pertaining thereto. The moment of actual command transfer was deeply moving. Commander Harrison approached me with the ship's commissioning pennant, the symbolic representation of command authority that had passed from captain to captain since the submarine's commissioning. As he placed it in my hands, 134 sailors snapped to attention in perfect unison. "I relieve you, sir," I said, using the traditional words that formally transferred command. "I stand relieved," Commander Harrison replied, saluting me as the new commanding officer. The crew's response was immediate and thunderous. "Connecticut, arriving!" They shouted as one, announcing to the world that their new captain had assumed command. In the audience, I saw my mother openly crying, not from sadness, but from a mixture of pride and regret that was visible even from the podium. My father sat perfectly still, staring at the submarine that his daughter now commanded with an expression of complete bewilderment, but it was Kate's reaction that struck me most powerfully. She wasn't crying or celebrating. She was staring at her phone, scrolling through what I assumed were the social media posts she'd need to delete, the false narratives she'd need to retract, the years of carefully constructed sympathy she'd built around my supposed failure. After the ceremony, as guests mingled on the pier and my crew prepared for their first brief under my command, James approached me with the careful steps of someone navigating a minefield. "Commander Thompson," he said, using my rank for the first time since we'd met, "I owe you a significant apology. We clearly misunderstood everything about your service." I looked at him, this lieutenant commander who'd explained military leadership requirements to me while dismissing my capability for command, and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction but wasn't forgiveness either. "James," I said quietly, "the misunderstanding was deliberate. You chose to see what made you comfortable rather than asking what was true." 6 months later, I stood on the bridge of USS Connecticut, 400 feet beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, leading my crew through a complex tactical exercise that would have been impossible to explain to my family even if it weren't classified. The transformation had been remarkable, not just in my relationship with my family, but in my understanding of what truth costs and what silence protects. Connecticut had become more than my command. It had become proof that excellence doesn't require external validation. My crew of 134 sailors knew exactly who their captain was, what she'd accomplished, and what she was capable of. Their respect was earned through competence, not corrected through revelation. The personal costs had been significant but necessary. Kate and I had managed exactly 2 conversations since the change of command ceremony, both painful exercises in navigating the wreckage of assumptions and the debris of 8 years of constructed narratives. She'd deleted most of her social media posts about my struggles and stopped using my military service as a conversation topic entirely. James had requested a transfer to a different base, apparently unable to face the daily reminder of his professional misjudgment. Before leaving, he'd written me a formal letter acknowledging his errors, a gesture that felt more like career protection than genuine remorse. The rest of my family had adapted with varying degrees of success. Some embraced the truth with genuine pride and curiosity about my actual work. Others retreated into uncomfortable silence, unable to reconcile their assumptions about military failure with the reality of submarine command. My parents had surprised me most. After the initial shock wore off, they'd begun asking real questions about my career, my responsibilities, my future plans. "We never asked because we thought we already knew," my mother had said during our first honest conversation about my service. "We saw what we expected instead of seeing what was there." But the moment that mattered most came last month, when I received a message from a young female midshipman at the Naval Academy. She'd read an interview I'd given about submarine command and wanted advice about pursuing nuclear training. Commander Thompson, she'd written, thank you for proving that leadership isn't about who believes in you. It's about who you choose to become. Reading that message, I understood that the most important victory hadn't been proving my family wrong about my capabilities. It had been proving to myself that my worth wasn't determined by their understanding or approval. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought in war zones or command centers. They're fought in the quiet spaces where you choose truth over comfort, integrity over acceptance, and authentic success over performed failure. Sometimes the greatest service you can provide isn't to your country or your crew, but to the person you were meant to become when no one was watching, when no one was cheering, when no one believed it was possible. And sometimes the family that underestimates you gives you the greatest gift of all, the freedom to succeed beyond their imagination and the strength to command your own story. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.